Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third session of Naturenomics Dialogues 2.0, a series of digital dialogues which is a part of a larger initiative of our flagship platform, the Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum. Last year at the 8th Eastern Himalayan Naturenomics Forum, the Balipara Foundation held multiple conversations on the theme of ecology is economy. Building on these conversations and the key outcomes from the forum, this series of Naturenomics dialogues will explore and debate the theme of rewilding the future, moving beyond rewilding as a means of restoring our natural ecosystems to restoring the interdependence between our natural, social, and economic systems by building a new natural capital economy led by indigenous and rural communities. In our last session, we explored the theme of forests for health, the intersection of zoonotic diseases, emergence and our shrinking wildlife landscapes, and the risks the Eastern Himalayan region faces. Today, we explore one of the key outcomes from last year's forum, which has also been at the heart of our work through the idea of naturenomics, which is the need to change how we think of monetary flows in our economy and to move towards green accounting and create an ecological budget. The Eastern Himalayas are natural capital rich, but fiscally poor. Valuing nature and ecological budgeting is the quickest and most robust tool the region has to closing its critical capital gap for social inclusion. Today on our panel, Rewilding the Ecological Budget, we are discussing the importance of an ecological budget in driving a naturenomics economy needed to achieve a balance between rural and urban communities and invest in rural communities. We are truly honored to have eminent personalities with us today to share their insights on how voices and concerns from different sectors of the Eastern Himalayan communities can be centered in conversations on the environment and its restoration. With this, I would like to introduce the panelists for today. Mr. Saurav Roy leads the corporate social responsibility efforts of Tata Steel, anchoring a team of 600 that works to transform the lives of more than 1.5 million people from India's most underserved and least represented communities. He joined the Tata Group as part of the Tata Administrative Services in 2007, and his experience spans CSR, sustainability, development, and corporate finance across a range of sectors. In his last engagement, Saurav anchored the sustainability strategy work of the Tata Consultancy Sustainability Group and worked with the Tata companies to integrate social and environmental aspects within their approaches to business. His prior experience includes Grameen Bank and other development sector organizations in India. Our second panelist for today is Ms. Shalini Goel Bhalla, who is a climate visionary working with Niti Aayog on formulating policy in circular economy for India and currently chairs the International Council for Circular Economy. She has actively been working in sustainability, developing an award-winning zero waste program which helps entities to reduce their carbon footprint. She is also associated with MSME and the Delhi government. On their entrepreneurship mindset program, Shalini has received awards from Social Founder London, Global Goodwill Ambassador the US, the ICUNR India, and the 2020 Women in Leadership Award by Pathbreakers. An active speaker, she takes up initiatives in promoting educational opportunities, leadership development, entrepreneurship, and empowerment of youth and women. Oliver Miltenberger is an expert in ecological conservation and the economics of climate change. He has worked with multiple countries on every continent to support protected areas, manage land, and the socio-economic systems that drive them. He owns and operates various consulting groups and has held positions with the US Geological Survey and NASA, and served as fellow or grantee at the National Science Foundation USA, USAID, Harvard Travelers Program, Colorado School of Global Environmental Sustainability, and German-Australian Climate and Energy College. Oliver is currently a visiting scholar at UC Berkeley and late-stage PhD candidate at the University of Melbourne, where he studies the global scale-up of climate-smart agriculture, the design of carbon markets, and pathways for different countries to reach their Paris Agreement ambitions. I would thank you all for joining us today. I hope the viewers will engage with today's discussion by putting forward their questions. We'll be accepting a total of 5 questions for the panelists, and we request you to put all your questions in the Zoom Q&A box you see on your screen. So without further delays, I would like to direct the very first question to Shalini. So you have been involved in the execution of several CSR activities on the grassroots level. How do you envision the application of an ecological budget for a more concerted sustainability practice, especially from the CSR perspective? And how can we integrate the idea of an ecological budget within the CSR spending?
Thank you, Ankit. Thank you for inviting me and an elaborate introduction of all the panelists. It's a privilege to be here with Oliver and Saurabh and discuss about the subject, which is of a very, very important and is very, very significant, especially when looking at the northeastern part of the country, because how I see the Northeast India is not only the kind of sustainability that is happening, but it is, I would also call the area of sustainability and the sustainable practices. And there is a lot to learn from this area. So you have the ecological advantages, and this area is specifically quite sustainable in all the practices yet. And so there is a lot that we can learn together from this forum. Thank you for putting up this question as well. What I think is, as we talk about CSR from around the country, I see a lot of effort going on in education and health sectors, particularly, and environment till 2019 had taken a backseat or was not very, very important and mentioned in the CSR activities of many companies, if you would see. But gradually after the pandemic, I think most of the companies have realized the importance of environment, also sustainability. And pandemic has proved that sustainability is an extremely important part, and we all need to focus on that. And I assume that because of this, a huge shift in the mindset, transition would be seen with companies and CSR focusing more on sustainability and sustainable practices. So, and I'm looking forward to that. And as I consult a lot of organizations, one thing that I always tell them is to look at the sustainable practices and imbibe that into their culture gradually. But yes, if you look at the CSR programs and the way they are happening, I would say that more focus needs to be given into planning the program. So our planning phase, I would say, needs little bit more investment in terms of time, in terms of the objectives of the program, and also finding and validating data on the ground. So there should be a connection between the organization which is going to work vis-a-vis the organization which is planning to apply for the CSR programs. As we can see that there are multiple grantees in a grant. So sometimes what happens is the execution party happens to be a sub-grantee of the grant taken by an organization. So when there is multiple organizations involved, it happens like a Chinese whisper, where the actual objective for which the project was granted, we may or may not get into the exact outcome. So that planning of the entire thing and involving all stakeholders while we are planning the program becomes an extremely important point. So I think that is one thing that I see is extremely important when we talk about sustainability, because ultimately the area where we are going to work, the local communities, talking to the local people, knowing the local area, and also finding out exactly the typography, the demography of that area before implementing the project. Again, being a part of the planning phase is extremely important. So I think a collaborative effort from different stakeholders to make the objectives clearer and achievable is something that I would say is extremely important part. Another thing that I see in most of the CSR projects is that different organizations, they work in silos. So the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing, or the responsibilities at times are bifurcated to an extent that again, meeting the objectives become a slightly difficult task. So I think working collaboratively and not working in silos is another very important aspect of the CSR projects, and would lead to better outcomes. Last point I would like to share here, Ankit, is something which is very difficult to achieve, but if it is achieved, I think the overall impact of the CSR amount that we are spending today in India will become multifold. And that is not the corporates not working individually on the projects, but rather working in a centralized fashion. So what I'm saying is, if there are 10 corporates who are operating in Northeast, it would be better that instead of these 10 corporates working individually and writing any project or getting any project implemented, rather than that, if they could work in a combined, they would work in a combined centralized effort and direct the funds in a particular direction. They can work on a pilot project in one city or one area or a block, which can then be replicated to the other area. So this is really, really important. Centralization of resources, either at the level of the corporate or at the level of implementation, which becomes extremely important for a bigger impact. So that again is something that we could work on. So these little changes in CSR policy also could help, but I think they are very time consuming and kind of not something that we can work at. I'm only talking about the points which could be worked at individual NGOs level and the corporate who's the grantee of the CSR. So yeah, I think with the application of all these points, I think there could be a better result on the CSR front.
Great. Some really interesting points there, Shalini. Thank you. So I would like to take this idea further and would request Oliver to share his experiences with the payment for ecosystem services market. So Oliver, you are working on leveraging payment for ecosystem services with conservation programs at scale. What does this look like practically, and how can we mainstream these practical applications of natural capital valuation at a broader level for natural assets conservation?
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction and for hosting me here. I am very grateful to be on the same panel as my fellow panelists and given the opportunity to talk about this. This is something that's very important to me, and it's been important to me for a long time. So my background is actually in conservation. I've worked directly with animals and different wild landscapes for a long time, including in India for several years. And one of the main issue that we would have in these conservation projects is not that we didn't understand the science or that we didn't know how to solve it. It was that we didn't have money to do the right thing, or we didn't have the political willpower or the policies in place to change things. And so what my work has turned towards is looking at how we can start to approach both of those avenues, both from changing policy and in terms of routing finance towards these conservation projects. Ecosystem services are not a new idea. They've been around for potentially thousands of years, where we value certain parts of our environment. We'll value food, we'll value shelter, we value timber, we value clean water. But what's happening now is we are taking this idea of those ecosystem services and applying it to a functioning ecosystem rather than just an extractive ecosystem. So we are valuing resilience within our agricultural lands. We're valuing the lack of pollution, which is something that has been a concept that has evaded us for a long time. And insofar as we're able to do that, we need to change the way we think about values. And it's happening very quickly, the way that we think about the value of a healthy ecosystem. Because before, a healthy ecosystem was simply what it provided. But a healthy ecosystem now, the difference between an unhealthy and a healthy one isn't that you don't get as much timber or you don't get as much food, it's that whole ecosystems will die or whole cities will go without clean water. And so I guess the 2 points that I would have here is that we're approaching it from a social standpoint, where it's not that there's any particular lever or switch that we have to go after in order to flip the dialogue. It's that there is a sort of a mental social movement that has to happen that says that we value these things because they're valuable, not because we can understand what like what value in terms of dollars it is. So that's education. That's also just you know, speaking with people who are decision makers and trying to present this case that a healthy ecosystem is valuable. And so what we've done is we were actually working across every continent right now with about 30, 35 different conservation organizations, some of them very large international, some of them very small locals. But all in all, we represent around 1,000 different projects on many different landscapes and many different ecosystems. And, you know, separately, everybody's confused. Nobody has a collective voice. And together we can say, what are the common problems? Well, the common problems are that we know what's wrong, but we don't have the money for it. And so we can approach certain systems like international aid groups or markets that will purchase ecosystem services. And we can go as a collective unit to those entities and present our case in a unified front rather than being dispersed. And that does a couple things. One, it makes it very likely that they'll listen and want to change. But secondly, it means that these conservation groups on the ground don't get taken advantage of by having middlemen come in or developers come in and try and sell some magic cure-all to how to take care of an environment or present ultimatums. In South Africa, we were presented with an ultimatum where we had to either allow people to hunt our lions or the land was going to be sold off for farming rights. So it was like we had to sell our conservation, what we were conserving, in order to continue conserving them. And the alternative was to not do it. And I think that's not an ultimatum that should exist. And so we're working to sort of flip the script on how we think about our approach to making policy and getting finance to those places. Sorry, I took a bit more time than I think, but thank you for letting me answer the question.
No, it's perfectly fine. Thank you for your insights and your experiences that you have shared. So we'll come back to this question in the second round and we'll maybe try to build it further. For now, Saurav, you have been working with Tata Steel Foundation on the grassroots and trying to deal with the idea of ecological budgets on a very democratic and grassroots level. So could you share your views on the practicality of an ecological budget and in what ways can we develop it as a more tangible and pragmatic instrument to tackle the climate and biodiversity crisis?
So thank you, Ankit. And again, Shalini, Oliver, pleasure to be in conversation with you. So this is an interesting subject because it's a very complicated subject, but if you actually go into the core of it, it's not that complicated. It's quite simple actually. The basics are simple, and I think Oliver put it out quite elegantly and gave some very interesting examples of that. See, the good news is that there's been a huge amount of thinking that has gone into eco-budgeting and the various levers that go into ecological budgeting, and there's a lot of science and tech are making sort of interesting strides, as are instruments. Oliver's working on an instrument. I think Shalini is working on a very how does one put it, very critical lever of eco-budgeting herself, right? But on the practicality piece, I think it's important to begin with. I don't know. Let me be a little contrarian, if I may. I think it's just important to ask ourselves the question upfront that whose budget is this anyway? I mean, when we talk of an ecological budget, whose budget are we talking about? In terms of how shared is this, how co-created is this, and how much investment of this budget is actually going into sort of appreciation of the nuances and lessons that lie out there. So I think there are the magic actually happens in I mean, it's not an established model, but if you allow me the liberty, magic actually happened at 3 points of overlap, if you ask me. And I see increasing realization of this, but I think we should do more of this to actually arrive at some of these, arrive at more practical eco budgets, as we said. The first is, I think, a distinct understanding that there is actually nothing called social or environment. It's all societal. I think there's a lot of conversation around this, but I think actually, I mean, this is something that really needs to be internalized, right? And therefore, I think some amount of resource allocation that needs to be done by organizations or individuals who are working on this, on just creating the correct coaching and the correct learning environments for colleagues and friends and institutions who are working on these domains, so that the right principles go into eco-budget. Okay, and the second issue that comes up, when we are talking of eco-budgeting, is this whole concept of measurability, and an assignment of a value, and that is actually a surprising source of strife all across. Right, there are actually, you evidence something, then you measure something, and then you probably ascribe a value. That's the typical, sort of flow. And I say this from everything that we have learned from both my teams and a lot of huge amount of work with indigenous communities and otherwise. Not everything that can be evidenced is evidenced in manners that are very easily understood by us. Most of the critical learnings, I think that example of that Oliver just gave out, it's a lived experience, right? Of the choices, the actual choices of conservation. Sometimes these lessons are not available in, let's say, a PowerPoint or an Excel format, and it's important for any of us who's working in eco-budgeting to actually be open to these experiences and sort of be a little reflective. So you can evidence them, but you may not be able to measure them yet, right? So one can move from that journey from evidencing to measuring to ascribing a value. Oftentimes the issue which takes away from a practical eco-budget is a little bit of haste in applying this process. Let's just get to a value quickly. I mean, honestly, ecology and nature was built up over, it's been around for much longer than all of us, and we can't really be in a hurry to put a value to some of these things. Some things are intergenerational. We tend to call them intergenerational and then be in a hurry to, finish it off, in this generation. And that's not how, the original holders of forests, that's not how indigenous communities work. So it's important to be a little reflective in this journey. I'm sure Oliver Shalini even debate this, but I think sometimes the impracticality of an eco budget actually stems from that. Sometimes the failure of a project actually stems from that. And finally, this whole, the question I started with the third balance is this whole balance between I'm going to say communities and institutions, but what I really mean is a very tacit and real understanding of who really is the owner of the resources that we're talking about, who do they really belong to, whose heritage is it, whose culture is it, right? I mean, not from an ownership perspective, but from a understanding perspective. And therefore, I think I'm going to maybe dwell on it a little more in the second half, but just an understanding that if today I have an eco budget within my own organization, if I have an eco budget within my own institution, unless that eco budget is actually filtered down to actual sort of budgeting at the grassroots, unless we are creating this whole chain of evidencing, measuring, and then valuing, and if that chain is happening only within our confines, it's never going to work. So therefore, how are we actually working at a pace with people who are the actual holders? In the Indian context, if you're working with panchayats, if you're working with grassroots organizations, in the indigenous context, there are traditional governance systems that work beautifully well, and typically they know a forest inside out, and then you will never be able to know a forest like that. So understand, work with them to create this vision, and maybe that's a little utopian maybe, but I don't think if you lose sight of this, as I said again, the good news is there's been a lot of thinking, there's been a lot of modeling, which is all steps in the right direction, but unless we can't lose a glimpse of these basic principles. So Oliver, I have successfully spoken for longer than you did, so I must apologize also. So I'll get back to you.
Yeah, thank you, Saurav, for rightly putting it up that grassroots are very important when we are trying to democratize something like an ecological budget. And on the question of democratization of our our ecological budgets. Shalini, I would like to know from you, your experiences. What are some of the ways in which we can build a more democratized ecological budget that not only caters to the business and economic interests as Saurav rightly mentioned, but also is equitable for it's equitable in outcomes for the communities.
Uh, Thank you, Ankit, because this question is very pertinent question, and this is something that we all should ponder upon while we think of eco budgets. Ecological budgets, it's very, very difficult because a lot of people would say tree plantation during the monsoon season in North India could also be a kind of an ecological budget. But no one can say that planting trees in a particular area, how much of them, how much percentage will survive, and who is going to take care of the plants in all the round year. Without having these basic information in place, a random tree plantation drive is not an ecological budget, let me tell you. So somewhere we need to talk about projects that really think of the grassroots problem and then work towards a long-term sustainable impact of the problem. So when I say that again, I'm repeating myself when I said the communities needs to be involved in writing the project. As Saurabh has also very clearly mentioned that it is the stakeholders, rather the grassroots stakeholders who would know most about it. And writing a project and implementing a project without involving them would really be a kind of a futile effort when it comes to ecological budget specifically, because the local community knows about the local environmental conditions, the demographics, and these definitely needs to be considered when we are budgeting for an ecological project. So that's the first and the foremost thing. Then I think quite a lot of points have been talked by Oliver and Saurabh when they said about the evidence-based kind of analysis that needs to be done prior to working on the project. For that sake, even evidence-based policy making by the government plays an extremely important role. Government also should focus from abrupt policy making to, let's say, the evidence-based policy making that is very, very important from area to area. And with a country like India, where every 20 kilometers, there is a change in dialect, there is a change in the temperature and the demographic conditions. I think it is extremely important that the local communities be involved on the basis of the evidence, and then the policies are formulated, if not at the state level, perhaps at the regional level, and that would be extremely important there. But when you talk about the equitable outcomes and communities, I think another very important thing is the project should be planned in such a way that they also work towards inclusion. Because most of the times, these projects, I say, they lack the inclusivity. And that plays an extremely important role when we are talking about achieving the SDGs as well. If we start talking about inclusivity, it may help us to achieve our global goals faster than what we assume. Another thing is the skill-based training that we provide is very good, but at the same time, the skill-based training should also be given with an aspect of employability, which will definitely help in better outcomes of the projects again. So any skill-based program that is run in any community with any community should be more focused on employability than just the project itself. That's very, very important, and that is how the project becomes sustainable. And I think rather than planning short-term projects, they should be long-term sustainable projects, and sustainability somewhere should be planned right from the beginning of writing the project itself, which is extremely, extremely important. So I think all these points, if taken care of, would lead to more equitable outcomes, both for the community as well as other stakeholders.
Thank you, Shalini. I think we would all agree to the fact that the inclusion of communities at the very grassroots is really important, and you and Saurav have explicitly mentioned this in your views. So, but one of the interesting points that you made, Shalini, is how just planting trees would not be considered and a part of an ecological budget and all. To so which leads us to the idea of greenwashing, of how these terms are formulated every year, and a lot of greenwashing is done just to ensure that the money keeps flowing in from other sides. So on this, I would like to ask Saurabh, could you tell us how can we avoid this greenwashing and ensure that the spirit of an ecological budget remains intact?
Yes, Ankit, I'm not sure if I can answer that in entirety, right? But uh, you know, I was talking of the continuum from evidence, measurement, and valuation, right? So to me, the strongest way of uh, maybe avoiding greenwashing, or let's say or strengthening information, is for an ecological budget, or consequences of an ecological budget to be actually linked to information systems or data systems, or measurement systems, which rely a lot on decentralization, right? So ultimately, I mean, an ecological budget is essentially a tool which will drive decision making. And I think the same drivers for decision making to work at a community level, at an institution level, and at a project or a program monitoring evaluation level. So for us, in our experience, in most social programs or even otherwise, I think if we are where we have information that is sourced and triangulated at a decentralized level, that is where our most robust and correct information systems have emerged. So what I'm basically trying to say is that if you have species registers at a decentralized level, right, and you use species registers or people's biodiversity registers, which is something that is uh, catching on right now as a concept, and it involves setting up the tool, it involves coaching, but ultimately, if the reliance of an eco budget is on a decentralized tool like that, uh, which also has triangulation embedded within them, that's possibly the strongest tool to avoid greenwashing, other than all internal checks and balances that might exist within any organization with governance. Uh, Two models of triangulation that I want to put out for maybe discussion or critique. One is, of course, where you have multiple stakeholders from within the same sort of decentralized ecosystem who are giving you information, and you are rather the program or the project or the lever in charge is sort of sitting and triangulating information, and then sort of making sure that they're reliable, what's coming in, and taking decisions. The other way of doing that is we've experimented with this piece a little, and I think it's worked quite well, is to actually create taking a little bit of learning from the old microfinance movement, create group collateral on information sanctity, where create social structures or create uh, you know community structures where the sanctity of information and the veracity of information that's being put out or that's being maintained is actually a function. Link that up to the social capital or the institutional capital that the community enjoy. And I think that's a very non-threatening, locally non-threatening way of doing this. Just want to put that out, and I'm happy to speak more about that. But I think the one answer to greenwashing, other than internal controls, is actually to look at decentralized verification. Back to you, Ankit.
Thank you, Saurabh. Yeah, I think we are all on the same page regarding how we need to bring in all the stakeholders together to strengthen the information system. But I would like to take this opportunity, and I would like to ask Oliver, like moving away from the social systems to the market systems and how they work. Oliver, like based on your experiences, in what ways can ecological budgets or natural capital accounting change the way traditional markets have been operating in terms of investments? And what are the best ways to ensure that these financing mechanisms are actually enhancing natural capital?
Right. They are changing the way that finance happens in a number of different ways. And I would sort of echo what I initially said, that there is a bit of a social revolution in terms of how we're interpreting the value of nature and ecological budgets. And the fact is that our financial systems and the way that our capital economy views the world has not caught up to that new interpretation. There are ways that we are changing that. And I do want to come back to this idea of decentralization that Saurav and Shalini mentioned, and working from the grassroots level. But maybe first is we'll talk about the ways that we've seen financial systems shift, and then talk about how that's being driven. So we're seeing new instruments all the time. So I sit on the task force for scaling the voluntary carbon markets. It's a UN initiative to look at how we can scale up markets that help to mitigate climate change. And doing that is taking an idea like carbon in the atmosphere, which is sort of, it's all over the world. And so the idea of taking carbon out of the atmosphere or avoiding carbon going into the atmosphere, we will call that a carbon unit, and we'll trade it in a new marketplace. And in some ways that makes sense, and it helps, but it also doesn't address the fact that the actual impacts of climate change are localized. Where there is emission, there's actual pollution. It's not just like it's +1 climate change. It's like there's pollution, and there are ecological degradations happening there. And these carbon markets don't quite wrap their heads around that yet. But the fact that there is a carbon market that exists now, whereas 20 years ago it didn't really exist, that's a positive step. There's still a long way to go, but it's a positive step in that regard. There are also other instruments that are being created. So I also work with a number of banks and investors to figure out how to think about ecological improvements through their activities. And we talk about what are key performance indicators. So within an investment, what are they wanting to keep track of and what they need to prove? And the way that those KPIs come to be required is, again, it's just a social construct. It's saying that there's now a mandate for this investment money to track greenhouse gas impacts, or to track the health of an ecosystem in one way or another, or the livelihoods based off of those ecosystems. So we're seeing that happen. We're also seeing new finance mechanisms coming out of banks, like bonds. So I'm not sure if people have heard about it here, but there are bonds now that are contingent on, for instance, rhino species being saved. So we can have upfront investments into some ecological issue that requires maintenance, and that could be conserving a rhino, or it could be managing a forest so that you avoid forest fires, which I'm out in the American West right now, which is a big issue. And we create these bonding mechanisms where you can pay up front and then you pay back over time as if it's a loan. So you're giving out a loan to the environment and saying, we'll give the environment a loan, we'll provide maintenance wherever we can, or provide protection, and then we'll pay that back over time. And over time, we'll get that service of it being healthy back. So that's one way that it's happening. And what's driving it is, it is social change, but there's also a lot of technologies that are being developed to help, instigate that move. So, we work a lot with different groups that are trying to utilize blockchain technology to keep track of and fidelity with the changes that are happening and the money and where it's going and at what points it's released so that the project proponents can use it. We're also looking at AI and using data science to really key in on areas around the world that are performing poorly or performing good, and then trying to learn lessons and retool our financial operations to reflect that. And then just to touch on that second question that you asked is, how do we make sure that it's actually providing change? So those are ways of targeting, but the way that you make sure that it's actually changing is you're giving power to the grassroots level. So we're working directly with project proponents to get them the benefits, the financial benefits, so that they can do what they do best, which is understand their system and participate in it. And then, that's how the change actually happens, rather than working from the top down. And yeah, so thank you for letting me answer.
Yep. So I think one of the common things that has emerged is the idea that ecological budgets should be more grounded in the social systems that we have. Building on whatever you said, Oliver, right now, I just want to know from you. So you mentioned carbon offset and bonds. So how do we popularize these ideas, and how do we, what are the key factors that would enable us to ensure that, the accounting systems and risk assessment integrate natural capital in a way that drives green and resilient outcomes for the ecosystems as well as the people? So we have the environment as well as the society together.
Yeah, so this is an issue that I'm working on currently with in several different countries, and it's different for each country. Each country has its own interpretations for their environment and who owns which parts of the environment. It's like Saurav was saying, it's like who actually owns the ecological budget, and different laws and policies and regulations have different interpretations to answer that. In terms of how do you mobilize it, the Paris Agreement is something that we fall back on often, and the Paris Agreement essentially asks each country to achieve a certain goal, an emissions reduction target set by the IPCC, but it enables each country to choose how it goes about doing that. So, for instance, in Mexico, in order to meet their emissions reduction goals, they can do essentially all of that through retooling their energy systems. And they don't have to touch their agricultural systems, their land sectors, their forests. So they're not super concerned with it. Not to say that they're disregarding it, but it doesn't put pressure on them to figure it out. Countries like Indonesia are the exact opposite. They need all of their land sector to be very much involved. And in terms of the carbon market's role in there and bonding mechanisms role, there's, like in Indonesia, they don't want outside voluntary carbon markets to participate because it takes away from Indonesia's capacity to actually reach their Paris Agreement targets. So what they're looking at doing is inviting, rather than carbon markets in, they're inviting private investment in, which is a bonding mechanism, or it could be a KPI investment mechanism. And the way that you go about doing that is, like I answered with the very first question, is probably the most ancient and effective tool that humans have ever created is a group of humans. It's getting together, it's collaborating, it's sharing resources, and it's approaching a central target or a central ambition in unison. And so if you can get a collective interest and get collective bargaining power together and approach decision makers, then that's probably the best way that you can go about facilitating change. But it requires actually collaborating and organization. And carbon markets are developing rapidly. There's dozens of different standards, and within each standard there are sometimes many dozens of different methodologies that address many dozens of different project types, and there's a lot of confusion around it, and there's a lot of every project has a lot of context that determines whether or not you're eligible, and just being able to understand whether or not you're eligible, and then if you are, how do you go about doing it? It's a big black box right now. And I think that it's vital to start, making some of that information, all of that information, more readily available to the public. And that's something that my groups are trying to work on right now. But it's hard, and it's changing quickly. Every day there's new policy around it.
Yeah, true. I think we all know that how important collaborations are, and bringing on Saurav on that, like, I would like to ask you, in what ways can communities collaborate and play a role in the development of ecological budgets?
Ankit, I think let me just tweak the question a little, maybe. Okay, and take the liberty of doing that.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's not just communities collaborating, but it's actually all of us sort of coming together to make that happen. Right off to begin with, one thing that has worked very well for us, is just creating programs or opportunities or platforms where holders of wisdom/experience and understanding of community systems. I mean, let's say community leaders or representatives of community leaders, and scientists, technicians, valuation experts, the, the managerial or the institutional holders of solutions. They actually spend quality time together, right? So one of the things that we do, and we've actually seen it work really well, is to create immersion programs and actually make sure that there's an understanding of community context amongst people who actually create the eco-budgets. I think Oliver was making a very important point of, I think it's very important to understand that while we are talking of social systems and while we are talking of community systems, we can't talk of this bereft of market systems or bereft of the larger economic systems. So the greater collaboration is how do you sort of make sure that both spend time together? And we've seen that if you trust the native intelligence of both sets, there are solutions that come out, right? But the issue is how do you create those opportunities? So I think more sort of immersion programs. Okay, let me sort of give you an example of, I think many of our actually all of our mining assets, for instance, okay, are actually today led by colleagues who have spent at least 21 days, 20 to 21 days in an immersive atmosphere away with communities, away from their immediate context. Now we are actually seeing a tangible difference, when they come in and take their everyday decision. An ecological budget is not just an ecological budget. Any budget can have an ecological component, right? So they bring in a social, environmental understanding and nuance to the budget, which is fantastic. Everything that I'm telling you is almost like second nature. So that's one part of it. And also I think the only thing the community is to do is for us to respect and the community to respect each other's institutions. There are many. I mean, in India, for instance, there are 3 levels of institutions. You will have the Panchayati Raj institutions. You will have the non-Panchayati Raj but government institutions, and you will have the community or traditional government institutions. As long as there is mutual understanding first and regard for what these institutions are doing, that to me is key as far as community collaboration is concerned. I mean, working on institutions and working on institutional empowerment or strength is possibly the biggest thing we can do for collaboration. We can't get communities to collaborate with amongst each other, but we can create that enablement. Right.
Yeah. So we have a few questions from our viewers. But before that, Shani, I would just bring you in and would like to have your view on how do you see the idea of an ecological budget moving away from just a theoretical concept to a more actionable one. So if you could just briefly touch upon this, and then maybe we move on to the second section and we take questions from our attendees.
Sure. Thank you, Ankit. Once again, I think a lot of points have been covered by my co-panelists. But yes, there are quite a few things that we need to work, because I work on the ground. And at times I've seen there are some limiting factors. I think I would like to add quite a few points from the project point of view and how it could be more practical than being the theoretical one. I think we talked about transparency, which is very, very important. So the very first point I would say is the transparent data collection is extremely important. The data collection and data analytics. There are a lot of tools to collect the data and analyze the data, and they should be use of technology, uh, empowering the nonprofits to use this technology should also be a part of the corporate sustainability. Also is the reporting and the I would say the measure and evaluate the monitoring and evaluation of the project and the measures. So I think that all the data points should be measured and shared in a very transparent manner. So monitoring and evaluation should also help in measuring the impact and quantifiable and qualitatively of the project, which is extremely important. I think when I say that, I also want to bring to your notices the ESG, which brings a lot of these parameters indicated. I think somewhere Oliver was talking about the carbon offset and the carbon credits, which is happening, but I think India still doesn't really have defined. Like I said, there is a lot of confusion. There are a lot of standards. There is no standard formula of doing that. No, and Indian government has yet not come up with their own strategy, and that is why perhaps there is a lot of confusion in the market. But somewhere we need to work on that, and bringing these carbon bonds is extremely important that way. And I think another thing that I believe could help is, again, from my practical experience, working with the nonprofits at the ground level and making mid-course corrections is extremely important. So as we move down in a project, I think one thing that we should always see is that the project may have its own diversions, and sometimes that affects the overall outcome of the project. So I think mid-course corrections are extremely important and we should always keep some time for that, and some time and effort should be indicated towards that correction as well. I think more or less this, but the most point I think have been already covered by them. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Shalini. I think we have the idea of evidence measurement and evaluation, and Oliver's idea of having a more regional and context-based approach to solving these problems is very pertinent, I guess. But Shalini, one of the questions that our attendee has is, now since you have worked, and this question also will go to Mr. Saurav, in CSR and corporations, like they only understand the language of bang for their buck. How could reporting on CSR and conservation change to be more meaningful for the intangible values created? Is the question clear?
I lost you for a bit. Could you just repeat the question, please?
Sorry. Yeah. So in CSR, corporations only understand the language of bang for their buck. How could reporting on CSR and conservation change to be more meaningful for the intangible values created? This is one of the questions from our attendees. So if you could.
Okay, that I think that is a bit of a generalization, saying that I think all CSR understand only bang for the buck. Actually, I mean, if I could play with the words a little, I think, and pick up from what Oliver was saying, I mean, increasingly, as long as the bang is correct and appropriate for the buck, then that's fine, right? I mean, there are, if you go to outcome-based financing structures, if you get into financial instruments which emphasize the right outcomes, those are. I personally feel that occasionally they may be a slightly more expensive way to reach a certain outcome, but that is the situation today. That may not be the situation as we go forward, right? That's my personal understanding of the entire piece. So a few things. I think I want to, again, three things I want to say. First, any cohort, any segment, whether it's CSR or this thing, will measure what they are asked to measure. Okay, and I'm going to go out and say that if you look all around us, the only estimation of success for CSR today seems to be money. Right? Show me a single ask or a single disclosure requirement which talks of anything about money, beyond money. Everything else is voluntary. Okay, so I mean, I think it's important to realize that in the Indian context, and I think that is a little unfair for many CSR organizations. I mean, particularly for CSR organizations like us who are actually implementing organizations, and I think CSR can be and legitimately will be able to live up to a higher standard than that. So I think that's one. Second, there are if you look at, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, whether we are a CSR organization or whether a civil society organization, whatever, what's in a name, right? I mean, ultimately, we are in the business. I mean, we are in the pursuit of impact, and then the same thresholds need to apply to any organization which is doing that. And I think there are most good CSR organizational programs actually strive to look at a results-based framework, monitoring framework, and a results-based framework. As I said again, I go back to my point on evidence, measure, value. There are many frameworks, like there is something called a social return on investment, right? Which I think is problematic. I mean, it's a great model, but it's a philosophical choice, because I think eventually, why would I want to evaluate my portfolio choices on development by how much money is being coming? There are certain aspects of development I don't want to put a value to. I can't put a value to, and I'm no one to put a value to, right? So those decisions are actually being made in CSR organization and development organization, and I think if there's one thing that I want to leave for this is this whole concept of responsibility, this whole concept of the point of the where does business lie in the hierarchy of in the larger scheme of things. I think is something to look at. CSR is a very Indianized term. CSR is a very it's one of the downsides of the regulation, if you ask me honestly. I think CSR is now used as a broad sweep. Whether so there are many facets to this. I mean, maybe another conversation, Ankit, on this would be great. But I think my one point I would want to say is, I think there is a lot of measurement of tangibles, intangibles that is being done. But I think if there's one point I would like the audience to take back, is that I think it's important that CSR is held to I mean, there are times when we are the only capitalist in the room, and I think I can hand on heart. I know the institution that I work for and the philosophy that I represent, and I can say that there are many like us who actually can and want to be held to a higher standard than just money. And how much are you spending? So I'm not sure if I'm answering, but I think that's where I come.
Yeah, money does bring in a lot of apprehensions with it, but to generalize is not a good idea. But Shalini, can you share your views on this question?
Yes, Ankit, I think I would say something we need to understand how the CSR law came into practice and how it has been implemented. And I think I would totally agree with Saurabh that generalizing it is not the right thing, because first of all, CSR law mandates the organization to invest this money into the good cause. And all of a sudden, we expect an organization to shell out 2% of their revenue beyond a particular number onto the projects. And then there are no specifications mentioned, and somewhere we're looking at. So I think even the law that has been written towards the with the financial objectives in mind. So asking a corporate whose core business is business and not social responsibility, or is not getting into these projects, has been asked to get into some kind of social projects. So I think there needs to be some time to give them the understanding and development. See, we give a lot of time to capacity building of every institution. So this institution, why we build, I think also needs a lot of kind of capacity building, and they are also learning the right ways of doing it. So I would say that not everyone is particularly thinking about the buck, but yes, there are some very good organizations who are working, who are inspiring the other corporates and non-corporates. I think another thing that comes to my mind is most of the times, any big organization, they work with the very well-known non-profits. So, this is also one reason I see that small non-profits which are budding and have very good expertise have been lagging in providing that kind of approach. And I think sort of you would agree with me on this fact that this is one thing that I think the corporates should look at, rather than choosing the well-known corporates and well-known NGOs and giving them the projects. I think the opportunities should also be given to the smaller NGOs. And that is, see, what I understand is this CSR law written by the Indian government, and also the policies that are coming up, be it related to the FCRA, be it related to the CSR, be it related to even the IT compliances. It's only becoming harder and harder day by day for the nonprofits, and that is killing the nonprofit segment in India. I don't know how many NGOs have been actually closed because of the pandemic, because of the lack of resources, and a lot of work has been hampered just by a small change in the FCRA laws. So, when they said the sub-grantees are not allowed in FCRA, that these big NGOs do not actually work on the ground, and they only sub-grantee the work to the NGOs. So I think these are small things that needs to be considered while these laws are being written. And I think Indian as the CSR is growing, as the corporates are growing, so are the NGOs are understanding the kind of work they can deploy. I think, again, I would emphasize the fact that pandemic has shown a very important role that NGOs can play in helping the government in from approaching to the people to broadcasting the message that the government wants to take to the people. So I think, keeping that in mind, somewhere we should give some kind of understanding and capacity building time to the corporates as well as the NGOs. That's all from my side.
Like you said, Shani, I think civil society has a huge role to play in any country's development paradigm, especially in a country like India. So like I would like to bring in Oliver. You like we talked about how money becomes a very important aspect of doing these projects on ground and involving all these stakeholders. So Oliver, based on your work with payment for ecosystem services and bonds, we have this question from our attendee where they have asked, have there been any successful bonds for reforestation, and what are the ways in which we could evaluate PES at a community level, especially with regard to forest range communities?
The short answer to have there been successful bonds for forests, yes. And part of the quickness to answer that question comes from the liberal nature in which a bonding mechanism has been interpreted for different economic systems. So REDD+, reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation of forests, is a UN initiative going back to the 90s. And it's essentially a bonding mechanism. It doesn't call itself a bonding mechanism, but you're paying upfront for a particular outcome within a system, and that is, it's paid back over time if the outcome is not maintained. So the IFC has a data bank of different examples of forest bonds that have been issued and have been successful. So yes, it has happened. There are groups in the United States right now that are working collaboratively with governments to essentially use private financing to bring in upfront capital to complete forest restoration projects or land scale restoration projects. And then the government who has a mandate or has interest to have those restoration efforts seen through, they'll pay them back over time at a premium. And so it's a large scale process, but the idea is that locals get the benefits quickly, the benefits happen quickly, and it mobilizes private capital that's a lot it's more readily available, and it can move more quickly without all of the clunkiness of government. And then the government who has interest is able to reward that whole system by paying it back with a slight premium on it. And so there's many different ways that they operate, and the idea is being refined. So in the Seychelles as well, there's another example of a bonding mechanism. It's for water landscapes, but it took the Seychelles debt ratio, refinanced it, and used it as a bond for restoration of its maritime areas and its coastlines. And so they get the benefit of having this reduced debt rate plus capital up front, to then they have a mandate to go take care of their environments there. In terms of looking at how PES can be evaluated at a community level, there's lots of people working in this space right now and looking at different economic approaches to assessing actual values. So looking at willingness to pay or equivalency values, and going in and working at these community levels to identify what they're relying on, how it's being thought of in terms of value, and then also being able to relate it to the larger systems that are surrounding it. So that where local communities end up suffering is when their values don't get translated to wider systems. And so it's dangerous to think that you should just look at a community level in terms of its values without thinking about how a larger system might, force a different value onto them. And so it has to come from both directions that you're assessing these values, and that communication needs to be prioritized from the community level upwards to interact with that system. And part of the way that you do that is you start at the community level, but you build out regional levels of understanding around services and values, and you have to keep building those out and interconnecting them. And that's how their values end up becoming accurately interpreted and accurately valued, and then having systems that honor those values. So
yeah. Thank you, Oliver, for your insights. And through that, we need to build down and empower the communities to take these initiatives further. Before closing in the session, I would like to share a few observations that our participants have made. So Dr. Kamal Bawa says, regarding Shalini's point about centralization of efforts, coordination and mutual learning will be good. Given the heterogeneity of landscapes and socio-ecological systems, we need multiple approaches and diversified portfolios. Thus, we should be cautious about a centralized system and replicable models. Maybe we need to think about this a little more. And Tamara Law Goswami says, the transdisciplinary nature of putting together ecological budget needs more attention. Many times, single subject experts try to address these things for projects. Collaboration is key. Indigenous knowledge and systems are key. Many cooks in this case works. So yeah, like whatever Saurav said, we do. And Oliver, you also mentioned how collaboration is really important. And I think this is one of the recurrent themes that we have had on this panel today. I would like to take this opportunity and thank everybody who joined us, and thank you all our panelists for sharing your insights and experiences. It was a great pleasure hosting you and learning from you, from your experiences. And yeah, right.
Thank you, Ankit. Thank you for inviting us. It was really pleasure speaking with Saurabh and Oliver, and I think we learned a lot.
Same.
Thank you. Shalini, likewise, and Oliver, pleasure. Have a good rest of the day. While you have a good rest of the evening.
Everyone. Yeah, take care.
I learned a lot myself. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
We are connected on LinkedIn, Oliver, and we shall be in touch.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, that would be great.
Thank you.
Okay, Saurabh, I'll give you a call soon.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Oliver. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.